You know, one of the amusing truths about history is that it rarely announces itself. The moments that end up shaping entire nations and economies usually slip in quietly, while the rest of the world is busy checking notifications or wondering what to eat for dinner. People imagine history as a grand event with trumpets and flashing lights, but in reality, pivotal moments love hiding in plain sight. And that's exactly what happened in a calm, almost empty courtroom in Washington, D.C. No cameras, no drama, no urgency in the air, just a handful of judges, stacks of legal briefs, and a decision that, quietly, may redefine how much power a single president can wield over the American economy. No one noticed when it happened, but everyone will eventually feel its impact. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, well, that sounds like something for political junkies or lawyers, let me stop you right there. Because whether you're a business owner, an employee, an investor, or just someone trying to understand why prices keep shifting at the grocery store, this ruling touches your life more than you realize. So let me walk you through it the way I like to understand things myself, clearly, simply, without theatrics. What the court said in plain English is this: the President of the United States went too far when he used emergency powers to impose sweeping tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. Not small adjustments, massive economy-wide tariffs, tariffs with trillion-dollar implications. The administration justified these tariffs using a law from 1977 called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. We'll call it IEEPA. It's a law designed for genuine emergencies. I'm talking terrorist financing, foreign cyber attacks, threats that require urgent executive action. But the court looked at the situation and said, this wasn't an emergency. This was economic strategy dressed up as one. Now, to understand this better, picture a company credit card marked for emergencies only. The kind you use when a tire blows out or the roof starts leaking during a rainstorm. That's what IEEPA is supposed to be, a tool for urgent situations. But imagine someone uses that emergency card to buy a brand new car because they feel the company fleet is out of date. You'd step in and say, that tool wasn't meant for that purpose. That's precisely what the court did here. It said you can't use emergency powers to rewrite broad economic policy. And I want to be very clear, the court didn't say tariffs are bad. It didn't say the strategy was misguided. Courts don't make policy judgments. They make authority judgments. They ask, did you have the legal right to do this? And the answer, according to the court, was no. Now, here's where this becomes more than just a legal technicality. Tariffs, especially ones hitting Canada, Mexico, and China, aren't just political chess pieces. They're levers that move vast sections of the economy. Canada is our largest trading partner. Mexico is tied to almost every major American supply chain. And China, regardless of how anyone feels about them, is embedded in thousands of U.S. businesses. You pull those levers suddenly and you shake factories, farms, tech companies, consumer goods manufacturers, you name it. Let me give you a concrete example. Imagine you run a manufacturing company in Ohio. You import essential components from Mexico. One morning you wake up to discover your costs have just increased by 25% overnight. Not gradually, not over 6 months, instantly. Suddenly you're forced to choose between a set of terrible options: raise prices and risk losing customers, absorb the costs and destroy your margins, lay off workers to stay afloat. Maybe you pick layoffs, maybe you freeze hiring, maybe you cancel an expansion that your town has been counting on. Then months later, a court says, actually, those tariffs might not even be legal. And you realize you might be entitled to massive refunds, money that could have saved jobs, could have funded your new facility, could have expanded your workforce, but now you're in limbo. The lower court struck the tariffs down. The higher court immediately placed a hold on that decision. Tariffs are still in effect, but the legal ground beneath them is wobbling. This is the worst possible environment for businesses. Uncertainty. You can plan around good news. You can adapt to bad news, but uncertainty, that freezes investment. That slows hiring. That creates fear. And fear is not something markets respond to well. Now, the court didn't just rely on technical readings of the law. It brought up something that's becoming more important with every passing year: the major questions doctrine. In simple terms, this doctrine says when a decision affects huge portions of the economy or society, Congress, not the president, needs to clearly authorize it. You can't stretch vague language from a 50-year-old emergency law to justify massive economic restructuring. If a decision will influence millions of jobs, billions in trade, and the prices of everyday goods, Congress needs to vote on it. It needs to be explicit, transparent, debated, public. Here's why that matters to investors. When authority becomes uncertain, valuation models become shaky. Suddenly, every company that relies heavily on global supply chains has to model multiple futures. What if the tariffs stay? What if they disappear? What if Congress passes new trade laws? What if the Supreme Court weighs in? What if new emergency powers get created? Each scenario leads to a different forecast. And when forecasts become uncertain, valuations drop. Not necessarily in a dramatic crash, more like the slow, consistent tightening of a belt. Markets don't panic, they recalibrate. Now let's talk about something almost no one is discussing. This ruling affects America's negotiating power abroad. Imagine you're China or Mexico or Canada. If you believe these tariffs might not survive the courts, you're far less likely to rush into concessions. You may choose to sit back and wait, thinking the American legal system could hand you a better bargaining position. Suddenly, the U.S. negotiating table isn't as solid as it looked last year, and uncertainty on the global stage creates uncertainty in markets at home. This brings us to the bigger issue, the structure of American power. For decades, Congress has been handing more and more authority to the executive branch, not always intentionally, sometimes because it was convenient, sometimes because lawmakers couldn't agree on anything, sometimes because emergencies, real or perceived, were used to justify bending the rules. But power, once expanded, rarely shrinks on its own. It grows and grows and grows until someone finally steps in, usually the courts, and says, this has gone too far. And that's what happened here. The judiciary reminded the executive branch that the Constitution still has boundaries. This ruling doesn't end presidential trade authority. It simply says that this particular law, IEEPA, cannot be stretched like rubber to fit any situation that a president wants to declare as an emergency. Other trade tools still exist. Other statutes still exist. Congress can still act. Presidents can still negotiate. The world doesn't suddenly become powerless, but the lines are being redrawn more clearly, more carefully, more constitutionally. Now let's talk about the road ahead. We're heading into a lengthy appeals process. The Federal Circuit will weigh in. Lawyers will file detailed briefs. There will be oral arguments. Judges will deliberate. They could uphold the ruling, strike it down, narrow it, widen it, or send it back to the lower court for a second try. And if the implications are large enough, and they might be, the Supreme Court could take the case. That alone could take months, possibly a year, maybe more. In the meantime, the tariffs remain. Businesses continue paying, importers continue absorbing costs, consumers continue feeling the ripple effects, and investors continue guessing, calculating, recalculating. This is the fog of economic war, not the dramatic kind we see in movies, but the slow, bureaucratic kind that tests the patience of markets and leaders alike. But here's the part I want you to hear clearly. This is how the system is supposed to work. Checks and balances aren't flaws, they're features. They slow things down because slowing down prevents mistakes. They force debate because debate prevents abuse. They require justification because justification prevents overreach. If you want a system where one person can rewrite the economy overnight, there are countries that operate like that. They're not places you want to invest in. They're not places you trust with your money. They're not places you trust with your future. Trust grows where power has limits. And that brings us back to why this ruling matters so much. Strong institutions are the foundation of long-term prosperity. They're the reason I've invested in American businesses my entire life. Not because America is perfect, far from it, but because America has institutions that correct themselves, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, sometimes after years of stretching. But they correct, and that predictability, more than any tariff, trade deal, tax cut, or stimulus package, is what creates a fertile environment for innovation and growth. Now, what does all this mean for you personally over the next year? If you're an investor, prepare for volatility, not crisis, a bit more noise, but also more opportunity. Uncertainty always creates mispricing, and mispricing is where smart investors thrive. If you run a business, plan for multiple trade scenarios, build buffers, create fallback supply chains. Don't assume current conditions will hold. If you're an employee in a trade-exposed industry, understand that the next few months may be turbulent, but turbulence isn't collapse. It's a sign that the system is readjusting. If you're simply trying to make sense of government, this is a reminder that institutions are alive, not static. They're designed to challenge each other, to disagree, to push back. And if you zoom out far enough, you see something important. Even in moments of uncertainty, America's institutions are functioning. The courts are reviewing. The executive is appealing. Businesses are adapting. Investors are recalibrating. Congress is being pulled back into a role it often avoided. It's messy, it's slow, it's frustrating, but it's also incredibly healthy because stable countries are not built on strong leaders. They're built on strong systems. And right now, this system, imperfect, noisy, slow as it often is working exactly the way it was designed to work. So when you look past the tariffs, past the headline, past the political noise, past the immediate reactions, you see the deeper truth. The boundaries are holding, the checks are functioning, the institutions are intact, and that, more than any trade policy, is what makes America a place worth investing in, a place worth building in, a place worth believing in. At the end of the day, systems with limits create societies with stability. Stability creates opportunity. Opportunity creates prosperity, and prosperity is built not on emergency powers, but on institutions that stand taller than any single administration. That is the real story here. And over the long run, that story is worth far more than most people ever realize.